Can I encourage everyone to take your seats as we'll get started? Okay, welcome and good evening, everyone. I love it when we have a group that's gathered together and so happy to be convened together that we can't quite get started. No, it's wonderful to see everyone in person. Thank you for joining. My name is Alyssa Ayers. I'm Dean of the Elliott School, and I want to welcome all of you here in person and everyone who's joined us on Zoom to our 2022 annual Kuwait Chair Lecture. I would also like to say, for those of you celebrating Ramadan Kareem, we have a number of important guests who have joined us tonight. I would just like to acknowledge them. We have His Excellency Ambassador Salam Al-Sabah, Ambassador of the State of Kuwait to the United States. Thank you for joining us tonight. President Wrighton, President of George Washington University, thank you for joining us tonight. Roshdi Younsi, who is Director of Middle East and North Africa with International Government Relations for ExxonMobil Corporation in Washington. Thank you for ExxonMobil's support to the Middle East Policy Forum since its inception. Thank you for your generous support. I'd also like to recognize Trustee Emerita Barbara Callahan, a colleague and friend of Ambassador Gnehm's for decades. She is chair of the Gnehm Fellowship Initiative here, about which I will say a few words in a second. And we are also joined by Trustee Emerita Nancy Broyhill, and we are joined by our Vice President for Development and Alumni Relations, Donna Arbide. Thank you for coming this evening. I want to note, just as part of my welcome to everyone, that although this is not a retirement party and not yet our farewell for Ambassador Gnehm, we are planning one later. We are actively fundraising for an endowed fellowship. We have a little bit of information about that in the brochure that we handed out to everyone. This fellowship will, in perpetuity, support students studying the Middle East through the Ambassador Skip Gnehm Fellowship Initiative. And this brochure provides a little bit more detail on it, including ways to support. So I hope you will take a close look. And we, of course, have information about our initiative on our website, along with a link to donate. I'm happy to be able to share with you all tonight that we have crossed the six-figure mark in our fundraising. We've now reached more than $110,000, for which we are very grateful. And most of all, we hope to keep this momentum going. And I wouldn't be a dean if I didn't ask everybody here to consider helping to support this important work, and consider that in doing so, you will be fostering the next generation of leaders focused on the Middle East. Now, tonight's event is one of many programs of the Middle East Policy Forum, which Ambassador Gnehm founded and directed until this year. The forum's programs focus on key issues in the Middle East region and bring prominent scholars and practitioners to the Elliott School. Tonight's event, the Kuwait Chair Lecture, has been an annual Middle East Policy Forum event. But tonight, as you all know, is special. This is the 18th lecture that Ambassador Gnehm has given, the first two when he was here as the Maurice Shapiro professor. But tonight marks his final lecture, as he will be retiring at the end of June. Now, I would like to introduce someone who has known Ambassador Gnehm for decades. I would like to introduce Ambassador Doug Silliman, who will speak next. He will offer some remarks about Ambassador Gnehm and his impact on foreign policy over the decades. Ambassador Silliman is one of our own as well. He is an Elliott School MA alum and MA in International Affairs. He is currently president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, following a distinguished 35-year career as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department. He served as ambassador to Iraq and to Kuwait, among other assignments. And he has a few remarks he would like to make before we move to the lecture itself. So let me thank you all again for joining us tonight. And Ambassador Silliman, over to you.
Listen, thank you very much for the introduction. Ambassador Sabah, it's very good to see you here this evening, Ramadan Kareem. When Alyssa asked me to consider talking a little bit about Skip Gnehm's impact on the State Department, I had to think back because I frankly don't remember a time when I didn't know Skip Gnehm. I had to think back a lot. And it was 38 years ago that we met. And you may not remember it because I was a graduate student here at GW, not in the Elliott School, at the School of Public and International Affairs. And I was manning the phone lines trying to raise money from alumni to make sure that the program could expand. And Skip walked into the room as if he owned the place and went around and supported everybody, patted people on the back, gave them advice, and essentially gave us all confidence that George Washington was a place that we could really ask for money for. And as a 22-year-old graduate student, this was confidence that I needed. I thank Skip for doing that. But this is the first thing that I learned about Skip Gnehm. He is in many ways bigger than life. He is energetic and he provides support for those people with whom he works. So me, I got my master's degree, I joined the Foreign Service, I went off to the Middle East, and then I came back in the summer of 1988 as the staff assistant, kind of the special assistant in the Near East South Asia Bureau. And Skip was one of the deputy assistant secretaries. My job was to get in at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning every other day and figure out what the assistant secretary needed to read. And on more than one occasion, Skip Gnehm was already in the office when I got there trying to prepare the assistant secretary for the day. So the second thing I learned about Skip Gnehm is that he is incredibly dedicated and hardworking. When he has a job to do, he is there and he does it, and he doesn't stop until it's done. Then I had an interlude of more than a decade where I didn't interact with Skip until he was appointed and nominated and confirmed as the U.S. ambassador to Jordan, where I was the head of the political section. And you arrived, Skip, if you recall, on September 10th, 2001. And on September 11th, at about 4:15 in the afternoon, I was watching CNN and saw 2 planes hit the Twin Towers in New York. And Skip was at his residence just starting reception for all the families and employees of the people who worked at the embassy. Despite the sad circumstances, Skip decided that we were not going to simply hunker down, but we were going to try to use this incident as a way to bring the United States and Jordan together. And you may remember we set up a Beit Sha'ar, we set up a Bedouin tent in the front of the embassy. And he and I and a number of other embassy officers stood out in the hot sun and drank bitter coffee and kissed the cheeks of a lot of sheikhs who came to pay condolence calls on the United States for the loss of life during 9/11. And an ambassador that was less inventive, an ambassador that was less creative, an ambassador who didn't want to be out there and showing how the United States really wanted to interact with the country in which he was serving, despite the tragedy in New York and Washington, wouldn't have done that, but Skip did. And I'll also say that's when I first met Peggy Gnehm, because I don't think there could be a Skip Gnehm without a Peggy Gnehm. I also remember how Skip and Peggy supported my wife, Catherine, and our 2 sons. I remember one very stressful week when you said, Doug, you and Catherine and the boys need to come out on a camping trip with me. And we went out into the desert, walked through Guerre, I think it was, because he knew it was time for me to decompress. So he's also a person who understands those who work for him. And this is a quality that was really evident when he was the Director General of the Foreign Service, which is the position that runs the personnel system for the State Department, which is not an easy job to do. And doing that with personal connections and feelings for the people with whom he worked and who worked in the system was very important. So then after I retired out of Iraq in 2019, I took my current job as the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, a job I absolutely love because I get to do many of the same things I did in the Foreign Service without anybody shooting at me. But to my great fortune, Skip Gnehm was on my board of directors. And he has been a font of knowledge, not only connecting my institute with programs and student groups here at GW, but also providing, again, advice based on his very long career across the spectrum for many years. So, Skip, it has been an honor to work with you over the past 38 years. It has been an honor, Peggy, to know you and to to work with you and to serve with you. And it is my greatest honor to present Ambassador Edward W. Gnehm to give the 2022 Kuwait Chair Lecture.
I don't know where to start except to say that I don't think my remarks are going to be nearly as pleasant as you just, even if they're not all true. But I want to say one thing about Doug, if I might. Doug was my political counselor in Jordan, and unfortunately, my deputy chief of mission ended up with a really critical medical problem and was not able to come into the office. So I asked if Doug would be my acting DCN, and the United States invaded Iraq. And during the next months, as you can imagine, it was chaotic. I had a great right-handed person, but I have to tell you that in my whole career in the Foreign Service, I worked with just tremendous people, and there are some here tonight with whom I've worked, and I will forever be paying tribute to my colleagues and the people who go into that profession. Well, let me begin. The very first word on my paper is shocking. I guess that's a good place to start. Shocking is a word that comes to mind to describe recent developments in the Persian Gulf region, not to mention the import that they have for America's relationships there. Just stop and think. The United Arab Emirates abstained on a UN Security Council resolution condemning Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal reports that the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates refused to take a call from President Biden, which the White House, by the way, later denies. The Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates refuses to meet the commander of Central Command, General McKenzie, who's there on his farewell visit. And then on television, we see the arrival in the UAE of none other than the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad being welcomed on an official visit, for which the US had no prior knowledge. And of course, both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have rebuffed US appeals to increase oil production to counter the loss of Russian oil. Well, what's going on? I mean, aren't these our close allies? I mean, why no condemnation of Russia's invasion from the Persian Gulf states, except, by the way, Kuwait, that knows well the tragedy of an invasion? Well, as virtually everything that happens in the Middle East, it's complicated, and everything is interwoven and intertwined. And when you try to organize a speech like I'm trying tonight, you'll hear me repeating myself because the point I made one place punctuates something else. But I think if I can sum up what you're going to hear tonight, it would be what we are seeing is a fundamental loss of trust and confidence. I didn't turn my phone on. My former pastor and my current pastor are here, and they always start the church service by saying, I hope all of you will put your phones on silence. I'm now doing one. Sad. Sad. All right, I'm going to start the paragraph over. What we are seeing is a fundamental loss of trust and confidence by the Gulf states in their relationship with the United States, and a consequent hedging strategy by Gulf leaders who are enhancing their relationships with other countries and adjusting their approaches to regional issues. Their dismissive responses for increased oil production or for a clear condemnation of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine have to be understood in this context. In the Gulf region, there's been a notable shift in the environment over the past year and a half. regional states have noticeably shifted from confrontation toward de-escalation and accommodation. They're reaching out to states that they formerly ostracized, aiming to reset relationships. This approach represents clearly an assertion of national interest. An Emirati official described it this way, and I'm quoting, "Our new approach emphasizes diplomacy, de-escalation, and engagement, ... and we put our own interests first." Well, the Abraham Accords are the most dramatic example of new relationships. The meeting of the Bahraini and Emirati foreign minister, along with those of Morocco, Egypt, Israel, and the United States in the Israeli Negev last week, dramatically highlights the new relationship that these countries have with Israel. Now, Israel and the Gulf states have their own priorities, obviously, in establishing this new relationship. But one of the very important common concerns is their concern about Iran. But there is also a critical economic component that goes beyond business and trade to extensive joint ventures in multiple fields. And secondly, there's been a dramatic turnaround of relations within the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, as several governments reversed efforts to isolate Qatar. I think in retrospect, one has to ask what was accomplished by making Qatar a pariah, and why was the GCC rupture so public? And then why now is there an accommodation? Well, I think one reason for the rupture between Saudi and Emirati was their concern about the Muslim Brotherhood. In their view, there was no place in the Muslim Brotherhood ideology for monarchical power. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood was raising questions about the legitimacy of the ruling families. Qatar, on the other hand, gave the Muslim Brotherhood refuge, many of them had fled for Egypt, and access to media, namely the satellite TV network we all know, Al Jazeera, on which they broadcast their Muslim Brotherhood message. Well, today, the Muslim Brotherhood really is no longer seen as a threat. If you dig deeper into this problem, you know that the rift has much more to do with the animosities between ruling leaders. Those feelings have existed for decades, and there's no reason to think that they have entirely dissipated. But for now, things are calm. The Gulf states, and I think particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have also moved to restore amicable relations with Turkey. And that is after considerable years of animus. As with that fracture that I just discussed with Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE took great umbrage about Turkey and its president's strong support for the Muslim Brotherhood, which again is not now an aggravation. And Turkey too had its own reasons for improving the relationship with the Gulf, both to overcome their political and diplomatic isolation and to attract Gulf investments. Globally, the Gulf states continue to develop their relationship with Russia and China. The OPEC+1 structure that brought Russia into an arrangement with the oil-producing, exporting countries, OPEC, oil producers, led to agreements to limit production, which has resulted in higher oil prices. This mutually beneficial relationship may have impacted on the United States before, but now with the sanctions on Russia and the new record-setting price of a barrel of oil, we can see it and feel it much more dramatically. Both Saudi Arabia, as I said, and the Emirates, the UAE, have rebuffed US, British, even Japanese appeals to increase oil production to meet the global demand. One cannot, this comes to my mind almost immediately given my time serving in Saudi Arabia and other countries. In the past, we would have conversations with Saudi Arabia, for example, to talk about oil prices and production. And generally, we could get some positive consideration for those approaches. Not true today. I think another aspect of the shift away from confrontation is a move away from projecting power in favor of a retrenchment and more flexible maneuvering. One observer that I heard suggesting that the Gulf states have learned how hard it is to be a power and to achieve success by using military force. I guess they didn't pay much attention to us today. They could have learned something. So we have seen the Gulf states backing away really from engagement in regional conflicts such as that in Syria, Lebanon, and Libya. And the big exception there, I quickly admit, is Yemen, right? It's not that the Gulf states no longer care about the outcome, because they certainly do, but they are more focused now using diplomacy, trade, and economics to achieve their objectives. So what's happened to change the regional attitudes toward the United States? Now, 4 issues come to mind as, I think, clearly causative. And I'll begin right off to say that none of them are new. The first are the ongoing negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. Regional states fear that an agreement will not tackle Iran's ballistic missile development program or its use of proxies to undermine the region, both seen as direct threats to their security. Further, they all believe that the increased oil revenue for sanctions to be lifted will simply enable Iran to increase financial support to all these proxies, which again will increase the threat to the region's stability. And finally, on this issue, regional states simply do not fully feel that the US does not fully comprehend the enormity of the Iranian threat. The second point would be the US end to support for the war in Yemen, a tragic situation. The Saudis and the Emiratis certainly see the Houthi movement with its support from Iran as an existential threat. And as with the Iran talks, these states do not believe the US is taking their concerns seriously. The third one I would mention is new conditions on arms sales. Hostile congressional rhetoric and Biden administration decisions, such as to place a hold on the sale of F-35s to the United Arab Emirates, further undermine the confidence of these 2 states that the US is in fact a reliable security partner. And the fourth one I would highlight is the criticism of human rights records in these countries. Ambassador Ann Patterson, former Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, recently described how well this issue dogs our relationships in the region. And I'm quoting, "There's no place where our values and our interests clash more than in the Middle East." It's so true. And most starkly, that is apparent in our relations with Saudi Arabia following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We have to speak out on human rights. We as a country and what we believe in have no choice. But we do have to recognize that there will be consequences in our relationship. Again, I said none of these are new, but today they play into a heightened concern about the reliability of the United States as a security partner, or some would even say as the security guarantor. I think in my opinion, US actions, I mean, both what we did and what we have not done, have exacerbated regional feelings toward the United States. But let's look a little bit further at these regional concerns about US reliability as a security partner. These concerns are not abstract, they're very specific. Since the discovery of oil in the Peninsula, The US has consistently treated Saudi oil as a US national interest. Therefore, until recently, it was always believed the US would take action were those oil facilities in any way threatened. Yet when missiles hit the oil refinery in Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, the US did nothing. This was despite good evidence that the missiles came from Iraq and were most likely fired by pro-Iranian militia. More recently, Houthi forces in Yemen attacked multiple sites in Saudi Arabia with drones. And it has not been too long ago that the US actually withdrew Patriot missile defense systems from the kingdom over very strong Saudi objections. Parenthesis, the United States has now sent them back, close parenthesis. A similar drone attack on the United Arab Emirates that hit the international airport in Abu Dhabi, which many of you may have actually transited at some point in your travels, certainly raised Emirati concerns about the US reaction. While the US did use its assets along with those of the Emirates to thwart other attacks, the Emiratis expressed great fury that it took 3 weeks before there were sufficient and acceptable supportive statements from Washington. And according to one source, 22 days before the Central Commander visited the country, which might explain why the Crown Prince refused to see him. Further, for more than a decade, our Gulf allies have interpreted official statements from the United States government about our intent to refocus to the Pacific region. They perceive this pullout as a pullout from the Persian Gulf, and hence a reduced ability and willingness on the part of the United States to support their security. And they have Iran very much in mind. I would tell you that in my trips to the regions over decades, I heard this concern expressed everywhere. And no matter how adamant I was to say we're not leaving the Gulf, their doubts, I might have even used the word convictions, remained early. Now, US officials at the highest level have repeatedly tried to address this question. And they know in that regard the enormous US military presence in the Gulf, but still, no matter how often you repeat it, there are still doubts. Underlying the regional concern about US commitments to the Gulf is a widespread view that the US is a declining power. They cite, of course, our humiliating departure from, some say, defeat in Afghanistan. They continue to note what they saw as US abdication of engagement in the Syrian civil war that resulted in a significant increase of Russian influence. And I mentioned in previous great lectures how many times they pointed out in shock, really, incredulous, that the US was not even present in the talks that took place between Russia, Turkey, and Syria about Syria's future. So they draw some conclusions. You may not like it. What they say is, you gave Syria to the Russians just as your intervention in Iraq gave Iraq to the Iranians. Well, what has the US done to counter this belief? Let me tell you, it's quite a bit. Starting with the continued presence of a substantial military force in the region. The presence includes the United States Naval Fifth Fleet, homeported in Bahrain, the Central Command regional headquarters in Qatar, and to that several thousand US troops in at least 3 GCC countries. As I said, the US has sought to allay the regional concerns about our ability and our reliability as a security partner. The most recent statement was one made by our Secretary of State after he had a meeting with the effective leader of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, in Morocco. He told NBC, as he is known, and through him the world, that the United States is, quote, determined to do everything we can to help you defend yourself, close quote. And he specifically was mentioning the threat from the Houthis in Yemen. In addressing another UAE concern, Secretary Blinken pledged to consult with the Emiratis on the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran. The US also took action to enhance its ability to counter the Houthi threat and attacks to the UAE. Moreover, the US did respond to recent Houthi drone attacks in Saudi Arabia by, as I mentioned earlier, redeploying the Patriot systems that it had previously withdrawn. There's also been a commitment by the United States to resupply both Saudi Arabia and the Emirati militaries with missile defense interceptors that both have expended in defending against the Houthi attacks. One thing the US has not done, which has not gone over well with either of those two countries, is to respond to their very strong appeal that we designate the Houthis as a terrorist group. Now, President Trump, I believe, on his very last day in office, did designate them as a terrorist group, but that designation was reversed by the Biden administration. And whether or not we should or shouldn't is very controversial. Well, I think while the actions that I have mentioned that the United States has taken are appreciated, in my view, they don't really counter effectively the concerns and uncertainties about the US that I mentioned earlier. So you must ask why. Well, I think one has to recognize that the developments of today are really the most recent episode in a long relationship with America. Let's look at some recent developments that had significant ramifications on our relationships with key Gulf states. I'm not going to go back to Genesis, but I am going back to the Trump administration. President Trump's first visit to the region was to, and I think it was his first visit abroad, was to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. A notable positive signal to the kingdom and to the region of our focus on that region. Unfortunately, during that visit, the president bought on to the Saudi, UAE, and Bahraini designation of Qatar as supporting terrorism. That was very controversial, even within the US government. It wasn't long, however, before we saw pictures of the president hosting the Emir of Qatar in the White House. I'll just throw a rhetorical question in your direction. How do you think the people in the region calculate what a power can do when it shifts its position so dramatically in such a short period of time? What does it mean for other decisions? Well, then adding to this, there was a rising congressional hostility towards Saudi Arabia in particular over the use of force in Yemen, resulting in very, very high civilian casualties. Moves to block military sales ultimately failed, but the hostile rhetoric registered throughout the Gulf. The administration did take action to curtail US support for Saudi military actions in Yemen. It stopped in-flight refueling of Saudi fighter aircraft and did place restrictions on the sale of certain types of ammunition. Congressional and public hostility intensified with the news of Jamal Khashoggi's murder and the strong belief that the Saudi Crown Prince had ordered that murder. That must be remembered that all this took place at a time when there was an unprecedented close relationship between the president's son-in-law and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, look, I mentioned these events and then what I'm going to talk about that follows, just to emphasize the real importance of personal relationships in the conduct of building up credibility in the Middle East. So I'm going to go then to President Biden. During his campaign for the presidency, President Biden called Saudi Arabia a pariah And here was a quote. There is very little social redeeming value in the present government of Saudi Arabia. Close quote. Look, we all know that candidates say a lot during the campaign that doesn't survive inaugurations, right? However, such words don't go unnoticed or forgotten. Early on in the administration, the decision was made to release the report, the US government's report on the murder of Khashoggi and the Crown Prince's likely involvement. And then, in response to a press inquiry, the spokesman, White House press secretary, replied that the president would not deal with his except with his counterpart in Saudi Arabia, the king. It was clear the White House was saying the president was going to have nothing to do with the Crown Prince, who really runs the country. I would say that was not a wise move. So going back to something I said earlier, no wonder the Saudi Crown Prince refused to accept a phone call from the president, if indeed that was. Well, fast forward to the events of the past month. Russia invades Ukraine. NATO launches major sanctions on Russia. The price of oil skyrockets. The US turns to Saudi Arabia and the UAE asking for increased production. Both countries rebuff our request. So, okay, bad enough. But the world does go on. In spite of all, Gulf states' relations with the US and our relations with the Gulf states remain important. While there are indeed issues and certainly multiple sources of friction, there are also common interests. And I would say foremost among them is Iran. As the Gulf states focus on what I described to you earlier as accommodation rather than confrontation, the big question is whether Iran is of the same mind. There have been several rounds of talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with not much to show for those discussions. My speech says, in fact, Iran announced it was terminating participation, but this morning's newspaper said they have decided to come back to talks. Hence the reason I always read the paper before I went into class. So just to reemphasize that the Gulf states do feel very threatened by Iran. And I think the only exception there might be Oman to the south. But given regional concerns about the reliability of the United States, the regional states are in fact hedging their bets. They're looking to shore up their security by engaging with others. The UAE and Bahrain relationship with Israel is one such development. While the Saudis have not joined the diplomatic collective, they have their own channels, recognizing that they too have a common interest in deterring Iran. So in addition to the Israeli relationship, we see enhanced relationships with Russia. I already described the OPEC +1 arrangement and their shared interest in oil production and pricing. But further, the Gulf states have seen the increased Russian influence in the region, recognizing that it impacts on their relationships with other states in the Middle East. And then to their economic considerations, and certainly options to purchase arms. China is another interest for the Gulf states. And first and foremost, one has to understand that China is one of the big purchasers of Gulf oil. It's also a source of new investment, joint ventures, as well as an alternative source for arms purchases. A little more subtle point is that the Gulf states recognize that Iran has a diplomatic presence in Tehran. And as China tries to gauge how it balances its relationship with the Arab side of the Gulf and Iran, just maybe China will be advising the Iranians to step back from some of the actions that are destabilizing in the region. The Chinese look at, they have been aggressive in approaching their relationships with the Arab Gulf states. It's evident by the number of high-level visits between China and the region. The question that I often get asked and comes to mind almost immediately is whether China or Russia can replace the US as the region's major security partner. I do not believe that any of the Gulf states see this as possible or even desirable. Even given the bruising developments that I've described in our relationship with several of the states, they continue to see the United States as their major security partner. They wish, however, that they could be more confident of how the US will act if, or perhaps better when, their security is threatened. A key point. For both the US and regional states, now is the time to seriously consider addressing a relationship. The regional loss of trust and confidence in the US is palpable. The US anger towards Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, due to their intransigence on the issue of increasing oil and their failure to more vocally condemn Russia, is also palpable. Yet the common interest, coupled with the regional threats, demand that both parties confront the problems and find solutions together. And I do believe that's possible. The Saudis, it appears, want the US to do more to address its security concerns, specifically increasing intelligence cooperation, specifically to counter the Houthi threat from Yemen. The United Arab Emirates wants a more institutionalized security commitment that includes intelligence sharing, combined military exercises and operations. The message that we seem to be hearing is, we'll come back if you come back, but with a plan. Bloomberg News recently reported that Saudi Arabia and the UAE want a formal treaty with the US for defense support. In other words, written guarantees. The report did add that bilateral defense agreements that are expanded or revised over time could be an alternative. Any of us who know anything at all about the Constitution of the United States and our government understands that it requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate for any treaty. So a treaty relationship is very, very unlikely to happen. On the other hand, the option does seem obtainable, which is defense agreements that include clearer references to specific threats and to specific assets that the US will provide when needed. That said, I come back to a point that I made earlier, that there's really no substitute at all for the maintenance of close personal relationships. I'm again referring to a Middle East culture in which this is all important. That requires ongoing close consultations, not just when there's an issue, but in other moments, just to find out what they're thinking about, what's going on, hear their views and opinions. Open lines of communications can fundamentally improve the likelihood of avoiding misunderstanding, and in fact, enhance the likelihood of avoiding, reaching common understanding. Unfortunately, the US has a very poor track record when it comes to cultivating such personal relationships, but the benefits far outweigh the cost. So in closing, let me just iterate that I think the United States needs now to step back from its anger, assess the current situation pragmatically, take action to restore trust with our important partners in the Gulf. Admittedly, restoring trust will not be easy, and it will take time. Most assuredly, it will take more than placating or reassuring rhetoric. It will take some positive actions that put real depth into our relationships. Thank you. Particularly when the messages seem to be so unhappy. How many times have I stood in front of either my class or a group like this and said, one day I want to stand up and give a really uplifting. And it hasn't happened yet. But I am now happy to take some questions. There's so much going on. I haven't touched on a wealth of things that I would have liked to have included, but then you would be here tomorrow morning and the university doesn't really like overnighters hanging out in the classroom. So we have 2 people with microphones. So I will call on you if you wait for the microphone, ask your question as concisely as possible. And I will do my best to answer as concisely as I can. Sina. Truth be told, he was one of my students. Yeah, well, he's now teaching others here at GW.
Thank you, Ambassador Gnehm. Yes, I was your undergraduate student, I was your graduate student, and I wanted to thank you for everything, all the things I've learned from you. You mentioned Russia and China replacing the US as the security guarantor of the region. Do you think that they would want to be the security guarantor of the region, especially China, given its attitudes, foreign policy attitude? If you see that coming anytime soon?
A very good question. I don't believe that either states intend to take over the kind of protection, security that we provide, partly because they don't have necessarily the assets to do that, but because I think they enjoy the fact that we do it, and they don't have to. But let's keep in mind that for China, one of its really national interests, fundamental, is access to that oil. And therefore, the fact that the United States, both its 5th Fleet and its Pacific Fleet, control the waterways from the Persian Gulf to China can't be something that certain people within the Chinese government consider lightly. So there are going to be certain incentives there. Honestly, my view of the Russians is they want to do anything to undermine our credibility in the region, but they're not going to shoulder the kinds of things. But look what they did in Syria. Who would have predicted this kind of, again, I fault the United States for really abrogating its role in this. Over here, my brother is from Delta Phi Epsilon, Foreign Service Professional Fraternity. I told them when they were standing outside that I'm not going to ask you a lot of question opportunities, but you ask really tough questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your speech. It was amazing. So my question is, with increased US intervention into the region, there's always an increased type of resistance. And with a pullout into the region, there's also increased attitudes where the United Arab Emirates and the Saudi, they don't like that. So what is the solution for the United States, and how can it, balance between intervention and mediation? And at the same time, is there a chance where the United States can go back to the days of the twin pillar policy? Is that even ever a part or ever attainable? Thank you.
Right. We mentioned the twin pillar policy. It was back really before the fall of the Shah, when we saw Iran on one side of the Gulf and Saudi Arabia on the other side as a balancing act. I think those days are completely gone. I've now forgotten the first part of your question. Sorry.
Increased intervention.
The real dilemma between when you do something, that's not liked, when you don't do something, that's not liked either. And that's part of life. And I think it's dealt with by increased dialogue. And one of the things that I wanted to say toward the end of my speech, but I realized that got me on a hobby horse, but you gave me an opportunity to get on it, is look, we don't have ambassadors in a number of these really important countries. Who should be handling the dialogue day by day by day? But your resident ambassador and the diplomatic corps assigned there. When leaders, and I'm not dismissing the ability to pick up the phone and call between leaders. There's a real role for that. But I know from my time in Kuwait, the number of times you just want to go into an office and talk about things, but you don't want to be issuing, going in on a demarche of some issue. But you want to get a sense of where they're at, because if you can talk through it, like I said, you often explain it. Let me give you one example, which I think is really important. That's on our military presence. I think one of the things that the Gulf states don't understand is our ability to project power and what our military would tell them we need to have in place to be able to respond to their security needs. So in other words, we can in fact take out a certain number of ships, which can be returned to the region quite rapidly if they are in the Indian Ocean. We don't need bombers in the Gulf. We never have. We fly them from Guam, of all places. But I don't think that they always appreciate. But if we explain it, here's what we've kept. Here's the capability that you have with what we've got there. And here's what we can do if, and you talk about contingencies. We have the joint political military group with Israel. We have joint commissions with Jordan, Morocco, and others. And that's what these joint military commissions do. They talk about what are the potential threats with them making a presentation, us making a presentation, and talking about, here's what you can count on. We've got in Germany 2 Patriot systems. We can move them in X number of hours, kind of a thing. And I don't think we've taken advantage of the dialogue, but you really need people on the ground, on location, to be able to do that effectively. Another question? Oh, you're all just being kind.
I'll jump in. You know, the Foreign Service always has questions. So.
No, but not about ice cream.
There's a long story to that one. Ambassador, you alluded to the tension between sort of a realpolitik approach versus a principled approach to our foreign policy. So, and kind of a follow-on to the question you just answered, how do we balance those two things? I mean, I know you did this as ambassador in many places, but there is a genuine tension there between our principles and some of the things that have happened, but the reality that you've outlined so well this evening, and that is not an easy balance to strike, I think, because you're gonna make friends or enemies either way. So how do we balance that, especially given the personal relationships and some of the differences in foreign policy between administrations?
It's a really tough question, and the answer is only partially satisfactory. As I've said to all my classes, some of the students here will remember me saying it. The American ambassador, the American government, has to be solid in how it feels about human rights. For example, that's the country, that's the principles that we were founded on, and we say we espouse and try to adhere to. The way I dealt with it was that I tried to always have that consciously in my mind when I was talking to people about things, other government officials. And when we would get into issues invariably, where I knew that actions of the government or of individuals in the government were likely to have significantly negative reactions in Washington and therefore on our relationship was to point them out early and indicate what the consequences, so that the individuals and the country, the leader, can calculate that into their consideration, what to do. And honestly, to always make it clear what might happen to the relationship. And point out, as I would do in many of the countries where I served, where we had very close military to military relationships, and lots of business relationships. Look what you're going to jeopardize. Look at the consequences of what you do. And I can say that without threatening. I say, I'm not going to do it, but someone else is going to do it to you, and you're not going to want that. You don't want that. So how do we get around it? When you have a situation like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the evidence is maybe a hard word to use, but certainly a lot of indications the Crown Prince is involved. This is really tough. Because you got, if you're the president or the Secretary of State, you have to deal with the hostile reaction of Congress and the American public toward that individual. Why are we dealing with it? Not to mention the fact that he runs the country and you're likely to need him. Oh, can you increase oil production? So it's very important that you don't say what the president said. Sorry, I'm starkly saying it. That I won't have any dealings with the Crown Prince. You can say, I don't like it, or I don't agree at all what happened. It's horrible. But we have interest with the country, and we are going to take care of our interest in this relationship. So it gets complicated, and you have to kind of tailor it sometimes to the situation that you're in. But I don't think there's any one of my Foreign Service colleagues in the room that hasn't faced that issue. You're right, and you too, Russ. I was told that comment.
Skip.
What?
I'm sorry. Go ahead and then I'll come to you next.
You mentioned in your lecture that even though the GCC had put an embargo against Qatar, Donald Trump still embraced Sheikh Tamim, brought him to the White House. The same is also true for the Biden administration. So can you explain, in your opinion, what has Qatar done, or why is the situation different with Qatar than with Saudi Arabia or the UAE that you mostly focus on in your lecture?
I do. It brings back lots of thoughts about Qatar in my life. One of the things that I didn't mention, that made the other Gulf states, made them irritated about Qatar, was this little peak squeak sand dune sticking out in the Gulf, trying to think that they're really a third power or better than us. And they did think to evoke that. I remember once, and I don't remember what year it was, the Saudis were planning to host a general conference on a subject. Doesn't matter what it was. It was like 3 months away. The Qataris announced they were hosting the same a conference on the same subject 1 month away, scooping the Saudis. And so, you know what, they brought it. Now, what has changed? Well, first of all, the Central Command headquarters is there, and they have been good hosts, very good hosts. That has enabled us to extend our influence, our capabilities militarily in the region. They also helped with talks with the Taliban, trying to host for those for those talks. So there have been some advantages to us, and obviously it builds them up, which they love. But I think in the end, it comes down to the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood, both the way Qatar was dealing with them, stepping back from what they were doing, and the fact that most people think that the Muslim Brotherhood is really a shadow of what it was before, after all that's happened in the region. I'm not one that agrees that they're gone by any stretch of the imagination. But so it is in people's minds, and so we really haven't had the same issues like arms sales that were reversed. Certainly, there aren't congressional and media attacks on Qatar or things like killing civilians in Yemen. But the way they treat workers in the country, yes. Oh, you're shaking your head the other way. Gotta admit that, yes. But I think it's just been, ended up being an easier relationship.
Let's go back to what you just said a few minutes ago about the bombers over the horizon and so on. Bombers blow up stuff. We're very good at blowing up stuff. But as Klaus had said, the purpose of war is to bend the enemy to your will. I don't see that all this bombing is bending anybody to our will. There seems to have been a break in the ability of military violence, destruction, to achieve political objectives. And I haven't seen that just because you look at the Middle East, and as you said, you know, the situation is so bad. We've had the wars in Iraq, Libya, and so on, blown up a lot of stuff. Anybody bending to our will?
You were right. I don't have any contention with what you just said. In fact, for most of us who serve in the Foreign Service, in the State Department, we rue the day that the military seems to always be the go-to place if you have a problem, that they're going to solve it. And there are reasons why we reach that conclusion in some cases. They're well-structured, well-organized, they can deploy fast, et cetera, stuff. But what they can't do are the kind of things that the diplomatic corps can do. If you decimate the diplomatic corps, but if you're the leaders of a country and you don't use your diplomacy, then you're going to end up resulting in resort to military action, which, as you said, doesn't achieve the objectives that we claim. There's some superb material about how hard we have worked for causes, and we've listed them: democracy in the Middle East, human rights, and what have we achieved over the last 20 or 30 years? None of them. I mean, this is, and again, this can be fleshed out. This can be flushed out, I should say, into something more. But you're right. And I can't remember the exact quote when Truman once talked about how do you define what's important. And that is it's your survival in the first case. And so having good thinking at the policy levels in the government as to what is really critically important, and then what do you need, what are the best tools to obtain it. And you don't get involved in everything, because not everything is threatening your survival. It's very, very hard for the US government, and forgive me for people who are still in the government, but it's very, very hard for the US government to sit down and collectively come up with what it is that we are going to focus on as our goals and objectives. And part of that is a government that's sort of multifaceted and huge, but it's also a factor of our rollover of elections and politics. So do we have today anything like what came out of World War II with Gnehm setting forth, the problem we were facing with the communist bloc, with Soviet Union, and the design, then what we had to do? That, of course, led to commitments by subsequent administrations to NATO and to actions all over the world to deal with an issue that remained clear in our minds as important. It'd be hard today to be hard pressed today to be able to come up with something just that clear. It's not. It's scattered. It's reactive. It can't be reactive. No.
Palestine, that's my question.
Did I mention
Say a little more.
it?
Days after the Negev summit, Foreign Minister Lapid goes up on the Temple Mount on the first day of Ramadan. Not very hopeful.
Was that a question?
Well.
Well, you know, Sean, by the way, Carol is president of the American Near East Refugee Agency, that I was chair of the board for a while, and for a short time interim president between him and Bill Corcoran, who's down here. A group that does terrific support for Palestinian communities in the West Bank, Lebanon, Gaza, and in Jordan as well. One of the thoughts going through the minds of the Arab Gulf states when they don't come out with clear condemnation of the Soviet invasion of Ukraine is the thought in their mind, look at what you've done globally to pull global unification sanctions against a country that's invaded another one, but you've never exercised that leadership and authority to try to deal with solve the Palestinian problem. It's there, we hear it, comes up. I remember when I was in Jordan, and it was prior to our going into Iraq militarily. The Jordanian public was totally opposed to a military intervention by the United States in Iraq. And when the administration officials talked about the lack of democracy, the lack of security, the Jordanians would throw in my face, oh, it's important there, but it's not important across the Jordan River. Two-faced you are. I heard it. And I think many of my colleagues in the region know what I'm talking about. So that's another big issue for us in the entire Middle East. Yes, Mr. Barrett.
I don't think that I've missed. I don't think I've missed but one of your lectures over the years. And to be very candid, they are depressing. But I'm a simple boy from West Virginia, and I have just a curiosity question. And that is, with all that we're facing, is there anything that could be changed in the State Department that would give us hope and make a difference? And if you agree there is, what would you recommend?
Well, I have opinions. I do have opinions. And I think they're worth whatever penny will buy, but I'll give it to you. One is that I deplore the overwhelming presence of political appointees in the State Department. It's outrageous. From when I joined to when I left, but it's, I think, even worse now. You always had political appointees at the top. You always had political appointees in sort of what they call the seventh floor positions. But you always had a career officer, usually in the Undersecretary of Political Affairs and others. At the assistant secretary level, and I speak particularly about the regional assistant secretaries, although Gene Dewey's here tonight, was assistant secretary of one of the functional bureaus. you know, the expertise of people like Tom Pickering and others, I should have left names out because I won't come up with all of them, who would then be next to the secretary when issues arose, who were in the room. Now, the secretary calls together people and he calls in some secretaries, they tend to be political appointees more like him. Or, again, I'm making exaggerated generalizations, but it's true. And we even have political appointees at the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State level. It occurred during the Reagan administration because the Reagan administration said you can't trust those bureaus. So we want one of ours there in the front office to make sure that they toe the line. But if you know the system, that level, the deputies in the bureaus are extremely important in mentoring everyone below them, all the way down to the junior officer level. If they're political appointees, they're not even thinking about that unless they're an unusual personality. And they don't know the system because they didn't come through it. Secondly, so where I'm headed with this is that, yes, we need to restore the presence of professional people into the important jobs in the department so that their advice, their knowledge, and their relationships based on years of working in the regions or in issues like refugees are heard and become factors in the decisions that are made at the top. I think that's really, really important. I do believe also that there needs to be, and again, I talk about the penny not meaning anything. You know, one of the sad trends over the years has been that the State Department could not get appropriations for different reasons, for different purposes, either with buildings or personnel or aid assistance to be able to work like human rights training and things of that sort. So what did administrations do? The Pentagon can always get an appropriation. So what if we put $200 million in the defense budget for state to be able to do X, Y, and Z? That rapidly becomes the military and the Defense Department becoming the actor in that area and not the State Department. So one of the other things that needs to happen, which I don't see happen, is in fact appropriations to the right department for the jobs that they're supposed to be doing. And that means enhanced appropriation from the State Department. Now, the third thing I'll say, this is a really much more controversial, argued by the career officers as well as the American Academy of Diplomacy. Our head of the president of that organization is here with us tonight, is a complete restructuring of attitudes and organizations within the Foreign Service itself. More training, particularly in leadership, management. Management is just not something that people come into the Foreign Service necessarily. It's not a skill they bring with them, and they learn on the job, and sometimes they don't learn on the job. And so the intake, more diversity, more training opportunities. One of the things that I, as Director General and the head of the Foreign Service Institute, Ambassador Ruth Davis, who followed me as Director General, tried very hard to get billets. These are military word for positions that were floating and were actually placed in FSI, where we took officers between tours from an embassy out there for a year's worth of training. How many times have I said since I came to this job at GW, to academic world, do I wish I had had time to read and think through the things that I had to read and think through to teach my class? I wish I had done that 30 years ago when I was in the Foreign Service, but I was constantly hit with crises. I didn't have the ability to take time off. And then to the attitude of a Foreign Service officer, if I go off for training, I'm out of the line, I'm out of sight, and I gotta get that promotion, that's how I get to be whatever it is that they want to be. And that mentality has to change. And everything I tried to do in subsequent director journals, I think has failed to accomplish that goal. So that's the third thing. It's not enough. It's still a great career. And we need desperately for good people. And I've had them in my class to go into the Foreign Service and bring into the service the kind of thinking and the kind of people that they are. And I think we are bringing in good people. It's just, it's in the constellation I just described. I think I'm getting the signal. My assistant Owen, yes, I should have been looking at my team to say, I think that's it. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I didn't get to all.